And we are now live on this session with Jill. Jill is a senior climate change specialist at the World Bank and is here with us for 20 minutes to discuss, well, climate change, I'm sure, but also other things. So, Jill, thank you so much for being with us. And maybe to kickstart, if I could ask you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Romain. Pleasure to be with you on this vodcast. As you said, I work at the World Bank as a senior climate specialist in the climate change group or division. And right now I work primarily in supporting countries to fulfill their NDCs and work towards their long-term strategies as part of the climate support facility, which finances this kind of work. As a sub-duty, I'm also looking at how we at the World Bank can move towards measuring our actual impacts on climate change on the ground in our projects. Right now, all of the multilateral and bilateral banks look at financing for climate change as a proxy for how much work we're doing in that space. And what we'd like to do is move towards actually measuring what impact we're having on the ground. So in short, that's what I work on. And my earlier background is in forestry. So I've moved a little bit away from that space, but it's still close to my heart.
Wow, that's a lot of things. That's very interesting. Listen, there's no need to say that climate change is at the heart of all the concerns and a lot of projects, including the project that our audience and our members here are very interested in. If I could kickstart, you mentioned NDCs, which may be something very familiar when you work at the World Bank, but for the people less familiar with that, could you please explain quickly what are they exactly? Do they come from, COP26 or the Paris agreements? Are they just like targets to reduce emissions? That's the sort of first side of my question. And if that's correct, or if you specify otherwise, you're going to let us know. How is this climate support facility helping countries to achieve those targets? Is it through dedicated project? Is it through policy? Is it a mix of both? I think it would be a good intro to kickstart on this topic.
Thanks for those probing questions, Romain. Just to, I guess, bring it right back to definitions and the Conference of Parties to the climate change agreement. Yes, the NDCs are really important, or the nationally determined contributions. They're determined by countries. It's very much bottom up. Countries set their own targets in terms of how much, how they'd like to contribute to emissions reductions overall globally. But the other side of the coin, adaptation is also usually treated in the NDCs, and for some countries is actually features more prominently where they're low emitters, for example, and where they might be a lot more exposed to climate change effects. So, if you look at countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, generally speaking, they're skewed a little bit more to the adaptation side. Unfortunately, depending on the capacity of the countries that we're talking about and their resources concordantly that they're able to devote to developing their NDCs, some of these are very high level targets and plans, but don't necessarily drill down to what this would mean in specific sectors, which is where you actually would have a plan of action and relevant policies to guide the directions both in the public sector and in the private sector to actually move the needle and have action towards climate change. So where we come in is actually the CSF is a funny constellation because we're picking up a little bit from where the NDC support facility left off, and their legacy is what we're actually building upon. So the NDC support facility is actually part of our larger, we now call them umbrella trust funds. It's a bit too banky, but part of our architecture, and it's now closing down. And picking up from that, what we're now trying to do is not just support countries in updating their NDCs, which a lot of, again, when we're talking about limited resources and personnel in some of these ministries, we'd rather put the focus on how do we turn the NDCs into plans of action and focus on the analytical work that will actually inform the kinds of changes that will be needed. So it's funny that you mentioned projects or analytical work. We kind of do a little bit of both.
Okay.
And in addition to that, what we're trying to do now, which is our new flagship program under our umbrella, is the whole of economy program. So what we're trying to look at also is elevating this agenda to the ministries of finance and planning, of course, and trying to look at what climate change will mean for these economies at a national scale.
Wow.
What kinds of fiscal policies will be needed, what kinds of subsidy reform will be needed, and just bringing it up to that level. And interestingly, our sectoral colleagues are very well versed in this agenda, at least on the mitigation side, perhaps not all as well on the adaptation side, which hasn't been the focus as much. But our macro economists and our poverty colleagues, although they're aware of this, it's very interesting, in economics language, they don't always have the concepts to actually incorporate this thinking. So we're trying to figure out how we sort of bring that knowledge to bear and translate it into terms that are meaningful for them. And then also have them take this up in their modeling so that they can come up with, scenarios and the policy planning that would be necessary to actually take these actions. So it's that was very long-winded, but long story short, just trying to elevate that one notch higher.
Yeah.
So.
It's very complex, but it totally makes sense. So just to make sure I understand and we all understand, and I don't want to paraphrase you because I think you explained it very clearly and with much detail. So thank you for that. But the previous approach was maybe a bit more sectoral with the NDC and the climate support facility, which you call CSF. But now how do you call that concept? The whole of economy?
Exactly.
It's to bring it to like a more country impact level with like the impact on the entire economy, which makes me think that maybe it's like a more efficient way to tackle climate change and its impact, but it also must be more complex, right? Because I'll take an example that is close to my experience and some experience of our members. You would take transport, okay? It's a very, I would say, traditional sector for adaptation. You take some transportation asset or infrastructure assets at large, and you find measures to adapt those assets to to future-proof them or to make them more resilient, etc. That's been like a long-term approach for that thing. But bringing those objective or projects at the higher level of the economy and have a model that maybe doesn't only talk about the infrastructure resilience, but maybe, I don't know, the circular economy or the whole life cycle cost and the impact on the entire economy. That makes the problem more complex to address. Is that correct?
So I guess it's a bit of a both and it's a bit of a conundrum. I guess what we've been seeing is obviously we can make inroads on a sector by sector basis, but one-off projects aren't going to make a huge difference in the scheme of things. So they're great in terms of piloting and showing the private sector what is possible in certain country contexts, right? Or creating the enabling environment. When we say we want to switch, transition to renewables, we obviously need a different kind of grid for that, right? That's more flexible, that can, take different inputs, etc. And so that's where we come in. We can come in with supporting lending for the grid, but then hoping that the private sector comes in and puts a wind farm here and a solar farm there, or that it's decentralized, right? But we can help with the initial investment for infrastructure, right?
Yes.
But what we're trying to look at on the whole of economy level, I guess up here as well, is, what are the overall risks, also risks for the financial sector in that country, stranded assets. We have, if you look at, just randomly a country I know a little bit better, let's say Gabon, right, which is blessed with, fossil fuel resources, but what will that look like in a new energy economy, right?
Wow.
They're stranded with these that has helped them grow to a certain level, right? But will that help them in the future, or will they be stuck with this? And who's going to buy it, and what will that look like, for example?
Yeah.
And with other countries, that have, other kinds of resources, other kinds of sectors that are very strong, what will the future climate hold for them? And trying to aggregate that up. So I guess the flip side of this is, you're right, this can start to look complex and maybe lose, one argument against could be, what's the utility in this? Is this just a theoretical exercise? Will this turn into something helpful for these client governments? I would argue, I'm an optimist, so I would argue yes. You need this kind of information, to make better, more informed decisions, right? So what we're trying to do as best we can, because we don't have an 8 ball and we can't predict the future, is we're hoping that this will help build a pipeline of future lending and future policy support and lending, so that this is sort of helping this dialogue move forward, because we've been stuck, right? Like you come from transport, so you're dealing with these physical assets, as you mentioned, and what this means. That in certain places where there are cyclones, or where you might get flooding, you need to make sure that whatever built infrastructure you have there is resistant to the 1 in 100 year or 1 in 1,000 year event.
Absolutely.
Like that's part of the way that you think, is sort of having this engineering background. But interestingly, Ministry of Finance, they don't think on those timescales, right? And there are also another aspect, not to to drag this out, but another aspect is also, we're looking at the political economy, right? What's sort of holding some actors back, and how can we influence that for the better? That countries don't get left behind, that we give them support to get this new infrastructure, that they're not locked in, we call that carbon lock-in, right? That they're not locked into the old infrastructure, but rather the newest and what's out there, basically.
No, it makes sense. All of that makes sense. You already convinced me at the beginning of your answer when you said, well, maybe more complex, but the old way of doing is not efficient enough to answer the climate emergency. That's what you're saying. And I can recognize that. I've been working on some projects in various roles in transport where I know that the project had a positive impact vis-a-vis climate change, but I know that within the big picture, that was not substantially important or important enough to really make a difference, to move the needle. And you said that at the beginning, and I thought about what you say, and I understand that there is a need, with my own words now, what you're saying, I feel like I could say there's a need for a more transformative vision of like what the economy is and how a country wants to grow. It's not only asset by asset or sector by sector. I like that you mentioned that again. So I'm just taking your words, but like the macro level vision needs to be more important to really be effective, right?
Exactly. And just also to make sure that everyone's on the same page and going in the same direction, that you don't have a very advanced agriculture sector and that other sectors get left behind, and also answering some of these critical questions, like which sectors to prioritize first, in this emergency situation, and who will be impacted and to what degree, and, what will this mean for poverty, et cetera, all those like larger countrywide questions. So.
Absolutely. Another benefit I see as well in this is I see a lot right now on the private financier side, a lot of appetite for green projects. There are a few large consultancy firms in the UK, in Europe in general, who say like they hire massively a large amount of climate specialists because their ESG strategy now is at the core of everything they do in investment of assets, etc. But what they miss actually, while they're very focused on deals, because those are private investors and they are required, right, as a lot of the World Bank literature have shown, like to really boost the growth and like crowning some capital. But what they miss is the macro vision again. So I really appreciate what you say of this new way of whole economy to look at the macro, and then that is going to be the umbrella for which after there's some drivers or some specific deals or specific asset that needs to be invested in. But before that, there's still this thinking, holistic thinking, to really think before just like rushing into project execution and deals, etc. Right? That's another way I can think of.
No, exactly. And so that you have, your left hand talking to your right hand ultimately, because there is an interesting, I can point you towards those resources afterwards. I don't have them off the tip of my tongue, but there have been a lot of interesting macro studies on, the weird counterintuitive effects of certain kinds of investments versus existing perverse subsidies in certain countries that, in one sector, you might be really pushing forward and modernizing and becoming, more efficient, less emissive, et cetera. But then all the while, not taking into account the effects of other subsidies impacting other sectors, which might actually tip the balance towards having more emissions. So it's also about doing this across the board and taking a real hard look at the setup in a given economy, and things that might have been missed before.
And that exercise, is it part of what you mentioned at the beginning, your introduction of your subset of activity of measuring that impact, right? Beyond just what is allocated for climate change, but try to really have, indicators across the board. Is that part of that as well?
So it's right now there are, I guess, two distinct pieces of work, but the logic is similar in that on that more analytical piece of work, it's a bit more of what you were talking about how on a project by project basis, you can have positive impact. So that's one thing you could measure, right? Is the impact of the project as such. Yeah. And then what we're looking at is what is the project beyond that? What is the project creating in that sector or in that particular country's economy? Wow. How is it impacting? So beyond just the project as such, what is it doing? Is it like I said, are you creating an enabling environment, which is a lot more powerful than, which is not to say that, lending to create, a solar installation is not positive, but it's not as powerful because it's sort of a one-off, right? And you hope that there will be copycats, et cetera, but it's like its own thing. But then creating a grid is enabling, right? And it's more powerful, maybe for the country, maybe even for the region, right? So for the sub-region. So it's a bit that logic, how impactful, how catalytic, something can be. And then
that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. The engineer in me still thinks in terms of challenges for implementation, because as you said, I absolutely agree with what you said. I just like that makes sense. That was absolutely clear. The one-off projects maybe less impactful. But again, I'm not even talking about the complexity of the design, but the execution, And now this climate emergency, sometimes the emergency fund like there was for COVID, where the World Bank, but also others deployed a very large support in a record time to try to help all those economy. Now the same message, I hear the same message for the climate emergencies, but I know by experience, again, with my experience as an engineer, that it does take time to then conceptualize at the macro level those approaches, then create a project that is under that with different stakeholders, including the private sector, then designing the project, then there's the tender, there's the procurement, and then the execution. So I'm not sure we're going to answer that question today. And maybe it's for another session, another podcast. But I'm always questioning the balance between how large your impact is and how quickly you can achieve results. I understand the transformative effect of a grid over the long run, but because we have climate emergencies and all the data shows that if we don't do something yesterday, we go in a wrong course, right, of the different scenarios. So it's not even a question, it's more so a comment for maybe if you have some thought on this one.
So I guess, it's always easiest to go after the low-hanging fruit, right? It's always, and yes, all of this is, I'm spelling it out in very easy terms, and we're talking still a little bit at a higher level and not about the practicalities on the ground. So yes, obviously, all of these things require lengthy consultation processes and design timeframes and all of that jazz, and obviously procurement, right? Safeguards, etc. But I don't think, I'm not trying to diminish the one-off, because I think, the one-off has a huge positive impact on the locality, right? And the people living around there. And so we need to continue to do both, and we will, because obviously we also can't impose on sovereign countries, we'd like to show them what's possible, right? And inspire, right? Inspire, right? But it's up to them what they'd like to prioritize ultimately, right? So we just try to give them, a toolkit that's helpful, and hope that they come to certain decisions and priorities that work well for them in their context, because we don't live there, and how are we to know all of those specific details, right? As sort of technocrats, right?
Yeah, well, as an expert, as you said yourself, that totally makes sense. Yeah, you have the expertise and data, and you make your case the same way you've done it to explain to us during that session. But then, of course, I think it's clear for our audience that countries are sovereign, and they can just either be inspired or be advised, but what I really appreciate in that work is like the open dialogue. At the end, it's a sort of a platform for discussion. There are best practices, there are examples that you can showcase, and then you try to build a relationship with those countries, and to show that there is a way, and then up to them to go for the implementation and the way they want. Absolutely.
And if I can just quickly, I guess I'm based in the United States, which is a pretty privileged part of the world, right? But we can see right in our backyard, if you build it, they will come. There's all this new electric car infrastructure all over the place. And there's so many more electric vehicles on the road, and they're not just the fancy Teslas. You see all kinds now on the road. So you see that policy followed by smart investing creates that enabling environment, that you can make this shift. So I think, we'd like to see that everywhere else, that you give people the options to have this amazing technology, and create that enabling environment.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the US, but not only. We have another session in this series where an expert from the UN based in Nairobi is going to talk about electric mobility in Africa and in Kenya, notably. So absolutely. No, that's a very positive message to end that sessions. We already went over time because it was so interesting. There's so much to cover on climate change. But I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to do another session with you. So for the time being, Jill, thank you so much. That was so much appreciated. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. And thank you a bit for sharing the vision and the approach on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romain, for the opportunity. And thank you to those of you who are listening in the audience.